In the early hours of a September morning in 2004, police officers in Tulsa, Oklahoma, were called to an apartment after a young college student failed to answer repeated phone calls. What they found inside would become one of the city's most frustrating unsolved murder investigations. Detectives quickly realized they were not facing a case with no evidence. In fact, they recovered one of the most valuable forms of forensic evidence investigators could hope for. The problem was that the evidence pointed to a man whose identity has remained unknown for more than 2 decades. Brittany Phillips was a 20-year-old student attending Tulsa Community College. Friends described her as outgoing, independent, and deeply devoted to the people around her. She had recently moved into an apartment in the Springs apartment complex near East 49th Street and South Garnett Road, where she lived alone while balancing college classes and work. Those who knew her never described her as someone surrounded by dangerous people or involved in a lifestyle that would naturally place her at the center of a violent criminal investigation. Her life appeared ordinary, making what happened even more difficult to understand. On the evening before her death, Brittany spent time with friends watching football and socializing. Nothing about the gathering stood out as unusual. She appeared relaxed, laughed with everyone else, and eventually left to return to her apartment. Witness accounts placed her arriving home during the late evening. It was the last confirmed time anyone saw her alive. The following morning, Brittany failed to answer calls from her mother, who immediately sensed something was wrong. Family members described their relationship as exceptionally close, making the sudden silence deeply unsettling. Concern quickly turned into panic. A relative went to the apartment to check on her, and before long, police officers were called to the scene. Inside the apartment, investigators discovered Brittany dead in her bedroom. The scene immediately suggested that this had not been a random burglary gone wrong. Valuable belongings remained inside the residence, and there was no obvious indication that someone had searched the apartment looking for money or property. Detectives instead focused on the possibility that the offender's objective had been Brittany herself. Forensic specialists spent hours documenting every detail. Unlike many cold cases from earlier decades, this investigation benefited from modern crime scene processing. Biological evidence was carefully collected, fingerprints were examined, and numerous items were submitted for laboratory testing. Before long, investigators obtained a male DNA profile believed to belong to the person responsible for the attack. It was the breakthrough every homicide detective hopes to receive. Normally, such evidence dramatically narrows an investigation. Instead, it marked the beginning of an even greater mystery. The DNA profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, better known as CODIS, the national database used throughout the United States to compare crime scene samples with DNA collected from convicted offenders and other qualifying individuals. Detectives expected that sooner or later, a match might appear if the offender had been arrested elsewhere. Days passed without a hit. Weeks became months. Eventually, years passed, yet the profile remained unidentified. Investigators interviewed relatives, friends, classmates, co-workers, neighbors, and anyone who might have crossed paths with Brittany during the days leading up to her death. Detectives reconstructed her final movements almost hour by hour, searching for inconsistencies that might reveal someone hidden within her routine. They examined whether she had been followed home, whether someone she trusted had entered the apartment willingly, or whether an unknown offender had been watching her beforehand. Every possibility had to be tested, because the physical evidence alone could not answer the most important question: who had left the DNA behind? Attention naturally shifted toward people who had known Brittany personally. Former acquaintances, men she had interacted with, and others connected to her daily life were interviewed and, where legally possible, compared against the forensic evidence. Despite extensive investigative work, detectives repeatedly encountered the same result. Interviews generated theories, but laboratory testing failed to connect those theories to the biological evidence recovered at the scene. One after another, potential leads reached dead ends. As investigators continued reviewing the evidence, one unsettling fact became impossible to ignore. Whoever killed Brittany had left behind genetic material capable of identifying him with scientific certainty, yet he appeared to exist outside every database available to law enforcement. The investigation was no longer simply about finding a suspect. It had become a race against time, waiting for technology, chance, or one overlooked detail to reveal the identity attached to a DNA profile that had remained anonymous from the very beginning. For years, detectives refused to classify Brittany Phillips's case as one that had reached a dead end. Every significant advance in forensic science offered another opportunity to reopen laboratory work, review preserved evidence, and compare the unidentified DNA profile against an ever-growing pool of records. Each improvement brought renewed optimism, but each review ended with the same unanswered question. The genetic profile was real, complete enough to be useful, and believed to belong to the man responsible, yet it still matched no one. The investigation gradually transformed from a search for physical evidence into a search for a name. As the years passed, investigators continued receiving tips from the public. Some came from people who believed they had seen suspicious activity near Brittany's apartment, while others pointed toward individuals whose behavior had changed after the crime. Every credible lead required interviews, background checks, and, when legally justified, DNA comparisons. None produced the result detectives had been hoping for. The evidence repeatedly eliminated people who initially appeared suspicious instead of confirming them, reinforcing the possibility that the offender had never been arrested for another qualifying crime, or had managed to remain completely outside existing criminal databases. The apartment complex itself remained an important focus throughout the investigation. Detectives revisited the physical layout, considering whether the offender had known exactly where Brittany lived or had encountered her by chance. They examined access points, the visibility of nearby parking areas, and whether anyone could have entered or left without attracting attention during the late-night hours. Investigators also reconstructed Brittany's final evening multiple times, searching for overlooked witnesses who might have remembered an unfamiliar vehicle or an unknown individual. Despite those efforts, no witness emerged with information capable of identifying the killer beyond reasonable doubt. The presence of DNA continued to distinguish Brittany's case from countless other unsolved homicides. Many cold cases from earlier decades stalled because investigators lacked usable forensic evidence. Here, the opposite was true. Detectives possessed the single piece of evidence most likely to identify an offender, but only if that person's DNA entered a database or could be compared through another lawful investigative method. Advances in forensic genealogy eventually solved numerous American cold cases by identifying suspects through distant relatives rather than direct database matches, leading many observers to wonder whether the same approach could one day resolve Brittany's murder. Law enforcement has never publicly disclosed every forensic technique applied to the evidence, preserving investigative details that could prove valuable if the right suspect is ever identified. Throughout the investigation, Brittany's family refused to allow the case to disappear from public attention. Her mother became one of the strongest advocates for keeping the investigation alive, giving interviews, participating in awareness campaigns, and encouraging anyone with information to contact authorities, regardless of how insignificant it might seem. Every anniversary became another reminder that a family had spent another year without answers, while the person responsible remained free. Their determination ensured the case continued appearing in media reports and cold case discussions, long after many investigations from the same period had faded from public memory. Investigators have consistently emphasized that the case remains active rather than closed. Physical evidence has been carefully preserved, allowing future testing if forensic science continues to advance. That distinction matters because every technological breakthrough creates another opportunity to compare existing evidence using methods unavailable when Brittany was killed. Cases once considered impossible have been solved decades later through evidence that had been sitting in storage all along, making patience as important as persistence. More than 2 decades have passed since Brittany Phillips walked into her apartment for the final time. Friends have grown older, investigators have retired or passed their work to new detectives, and forensic science has advanced beyond what anyone could have imagined during the original investigation. Yet the central mystery has not changed. Detectives are not searching for a weapon that vanished, a witness who never existed, or evidence that was destroyed. They are searching for the identity behind a DNA profile that has been waiting silently inside an evidence room since the very beginning. It is an extraordinary contradiction that continues to define one of Oklahoma's most haunting cold cases. The science appears strong enough to identify the killer, the evidence has survived, and the investigation has never officially stopped. The only missing piece is the moment when an unknown genetic profile finally becomes the name investigators have been waiting to hear for more than 20 years. December 1, 1994, began like any other Thursday in Fort Smith, Arkansas. By early evening, 20-year-old Missy Witt drove to Bowling World on South Zero Street to meet her mother, who was already inside, participating in a bowling league. It was a routine plan they had followed before. Missy arrived shortly after dark, parked her car in the lot, and should have been inside within moments. She never walked through the front door. That narrow stretch of pavement between her vehicle and the entrance became the place where an unknown predator erased every trace of an ordinary evening and started one of Arkansas's most enduring unsolved murder investigations. When Missy's mother realized her daughter had not arrived, concern quickly replaced confusion. Family members searched outside before contacting police. Missy's vehicle was still sitting in the parking lot, but it immediately stood out as something was terribly wrong. The driver's side door was open, her purse remained inside, and personal belongings had been left behind. A small amount of blood was visible on the pavement near the vehicle, as well as inside the car. Her keys were recovered nearby, suggesting a sudden and violent interruption rather than a voluntary disappearance. Investigators found evidence of a struggle, but there were no witnesses who could explain exactly what had happened during those crucial moments. The attack appeared to have unfolded with remarkable speed, despite the fact that dozens of people were inside the bowling alley, only a short distance away. Detectives rapidly concluded that Missy had almost certainly been abducted from the parking lot. The physical evidence painted a picture of someone who had been caught completely off guard before having any realistic chance to escape or call for help. Unlike many missing person cases, there was no indication that she intended to leave on her own. Her plans for the evening were well known. Her family expected her within minutes, and everything she would normally take with her had been abandoned inside the vehicle. The scene suggested an offender who acted decisively, controlled the encounter almost immediately, and removed the victim before anyone nearby recognized that a crime had occurred. The investigation expanded throughout Fort Smith within hours. Officers searched neighborhoods, wooded areas, highways, and nearby counties, while volunteers distributed photographs and missing person flyers across western Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma. Every reported sighting was examined, yet none produced a credible lead. Detectives interviewed friends, co-workers, classmates, and relatives, searching for any conflict or relationship that might explain why Missy had been targeted. Nothing in her background suggested she had enemies or was involved in dangerous activity. By every account, she was a responsible young woman with close family ties and an ordinary routine, making the circumstances of her disappearance even more difficult to explain. Attention soon shifted toward the parking lot itself. Investigators carefully documented bloodstains, tire impressions, and every object recovered from the scene. They attempted to reconstruct Missy's final movements from the moment she arrived until the apparent abduction. Witnesses remembered vehicles entering and leaving the area throughout the evening, but no description proved reliable enough to identify a suspect. Surveillance cameras capable of covering large parking lots were not common at the time, leaving detectives almost entirely dependent on physical evidence and eyewitness memories that became less certain with each passing day. Valuable opportunities that modern technology might have provided simply did not exist in 1994. As the search entered its second week, public attention intensified. Local television stations carried daily updates, newspapers published appeals for information, and law enforcement agencies across the region exchanged reports in hopes that someone might recognize a similar crime. Investigators also explored whether the offender had specifically selected Missy, or whether she had simply crossed paths with someone looking for an opportunity. The randomness of the attack troubled detectives because it implied the person responsible might strike again without warning. Yet despite hundreds of interviews and numerous tips, no evidence clearly pointed toward a single suspect. Weeks passed without a breakthrough. The absence of ransom demands, financial activity, or confirmed sightings steadily reduced investigators' hopes that Missy was still alive. Even so, The search continued across the Ozark National Forest and surrounding wilderness after hunters, campers, and local residents reported isolated locations that could conceal evidence. Detectives believed the offender had likely transported Missy far from the crowded parking lot before disposing of both her and anything that could identify the killer. It was a theory built from circumstance rather than certainty, but it explained why an abduction carried out in a busy public place had left investigators with so few answers. Then, more than a month after Missy disappeared, a discovery deep inside the Ozark Mountains transformed the investigation from a desperate search into a homicide case and raised even more disturbing questions than it answered. The remains were discovered on January 13, 1995, by two hunters in a remote section of the Ozark National Forest near Turner Bend in Franklin County, roughly 50 miles from Fort Smith. The location was isolated enough that investigators immediately believed it had been deliberately chosen. The distance from the abduction site suggested the killer was comfortable traveling through the region and may have known the forest roads well enough to avoid attracting attention. The search for a missing woman had ended, but the search for the person responsible had become even more complicated. The medical examination confirmed the remains were Missy Witt. Because of the condition of the body and the amount of time that had passed, investigators were unable to establish every detail of what had happened after she was taken from the parking lot. They were, however, able to determine that her death was a homicide. Several personal belongings were missing, including articles of clothing and jewelry, and many of those items have never been recovered. Whether they were removed to destroy forensic evidence or deliberately kept by the offender has never been established. Either possibility pointed toward someone who had taken steps to reduce the chance of being identified. Detectives returned repeatedly to both crime scenes, convinced that the parking lot and the remote forest had to be connected by evidence that had not yet been recognized. They examined vehicle routes between Fort Smith and the Ozarks, searching for places where the offender might have stopped or changed direction. They also revisited witness statements collected during the first days of the investigation, hoping that small inconsistencies might reveal a pattern. Hundreds of leads were reviewed over the following years, but each eventually reached the same conclusion. There was not enough evidence to identify the killer beyond reasonable doubt. As forensic science advanced, investigators repeatedly submitted preserved evidence for new testing. Items collected during the original investigation were re-examined using techniques that had not existed in the mid-1990s. Arkansas State Police confirmed that the case remained active and that biological evidence continued to be evaluated whenever improved technology became available. Unlike many older investigations in which physical evidence had been lost or destroyed, Missy's case retained materials that detectives believed could still produce answers if future scientific methods became even more sensitive. The investigation also expanded beyond Arkansas. Detectives explored whether Missy's murder could be connected to other unsolved crimes involving young women across Arkansas, Oklahoma, and neighboring states. Among the names that repeatedly surfaced was Larry Swearingen, a convicted murderer whose movements and criminal history prompted comparisons with several unsolved disappearances. Despite public speculation, investigators never announced sufficient evidence linking him to Missy Witt's murder. Other persons of interest were also examined over the years, yet every theory eventually encountered the same obstacle. Suspicion alone could not replace physical proof. Another question that has never been resolved is whether Missy was specifically targeted before arriving at Bowling World, or chosen simply because she happened to be alone for a brief moment. Detectives have never publicly identified evidence proving that the offender knew her personally. The lack of an obvious connection between victim and killer has remained one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. If the attack was random, then the offender demonstrated extraordinary confidence by abducting someone from a busy commercial parking lot within sight of a building filled with people. If it was planned, then the killer successfully concealed every meaningful link to the victim for decades. Interest in the case grew again, as renewed media coverage introduced Missy's story to a new generation. Investigative journalists, documentary producers, and law enforcement officials revisited original reports, interviewed retired detectives, and encouraged anyone with forgotten information to come forward. The renewed attention generated additional tips, although none has yet resulted in an arrest. Even after more than 3 decades, Arkansas State Police continue to accept information, emphasizing that a single overlooked detail could still identify the person responsible. The murder of Missy Witt endures because it challenges assumptions about public safety. She disappeared from a location where help was only seconds away. Yet the attack unfolded so quickly that no one inside realized a violent crime was taking place. Her car, the blood left behind, and the abandoned personal belongings all revealed that she never intended to leave that parking lot. Those pieces of evidence explained how the crime began, but not who finished it. The journey from Bowling World to a secluded mountainside has never been fully reconstructed, and the unknown miles between those two locations remain the largest gap in the investigation. In the afternoon of January 13, 1996, the quiet city of Arlington, Texas, was enjoying an unusually warm winter weekend. Children filled neighborhood streets on bicycles, while families carried on with ordinary routines, unaware that within minutes, one of the most influential criminal cases in modern American history would begin. The victim was 9-year-old Amber Renee Hageman, an energetic fourth-grade student who loved riding her bicycle and spending time outdoors. Nothing about that Saturday suggested her name would one day become known across an entire continent. Amber was spending the day at her grandparents' home with her 5-year-old brother, Ricky. Shortly before 4 o'clock, the two children rode their bicycles into the parking lot of an abandoned Winn-Dixie grocery store near East Abrams Street, less than a mile from the house. The location had become a familiar playground for neighborhood children because of its large open pavement. After riding together for several minutes, Ricky decided to head back to their grandparents' home. Amber stayed behind, intending to continue riding for only a short while before following him. Only a few minutes later, everything changed. A local resident driving past the parking lot noticed what initially appeared to be an argument between an adult man and a young girl. As he looked closer, he realized the man was forcing the child into a black pickup truck. The witness later described hearing the girl scream before she disappeared inside the vehicle. The truck accelerated away almost immediately, leaving behind only the abandoned bicycle lying on the pavement. The entire encounter unfolded so quickly that there was no realistic opportunity for anyone nearby to intervene. When Amber failed to return home, her family became alarmed almost immediately. Ricky explained that he had left his sister only moments earlier, believing she would follow him. Relatives rushed back to the parking lot and found Amber's bicycle exactly where it had been abandoned. The sight confirmed that something far more serious than a child wandering away had occurred. Police were contacted without delay, and officers from the Arlington Police Department arrived within minutes to secure the area and begin searching for evidence. Investigators quickly interviewed the eyewitness who had seen the abduction. His account became the foundation of the early investigation because it was the only direct description of what had happened. According to his statement, the suspect was a white or Hispanic male, believed to be in his 20s or 30s, with either dark hair or dark-colored facial hair. The vehicle was described as a black pickup truck, possibly a single cab model with a short wheelbase. Although the description narrowed the search, it remained frustratingly broad in a metropolitan area containing thousands of similar vehicles. Law enforcement immediately launched an extensive search throughout Arlington and neighboring communities. Officers examined nearby roads, parks, vacant buildings, drainage channels, and wooded areas, while investigators appealed to local media for information. Volunteers joined family members in distributing photographs and searching neighborhoods. At the time, however, investigators lacked one advantage that would become standard years later. There was no nationwide emergency notification system capable of instantly broadcasting information about a child abduction. News spread primarily through television broadcasts, newspapers, and radio stations, methods that required valuable hours before reaching large audiences. The investigation also reflected the technological limitations of the mid-1990s. Surveillance cameras were uncommon outside banks and a handful of commercial businesses. Most intersections had no traffic cameras, and private security footage was rarely available. Mobile phones were not yet widely carried, meaning almost no witnesses could immediately report what they had seen while events were unfolding. By the time investigators reconstructed Amber's final known movements, The black pickup truck had already vanished into one of the busiest urban regions in Texas. As daylight faded, officers expanded the search beyond Arlington, fearing the kidnapper might have crossed city limits. Federal authorities, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, soon became involved because of the likelihood that the victim had been transported across jurisdictions. Hundreds of tips began arriving, ranging from possible vehicle sightings to reports of suspicious individuals. Detectives evaluated each lead carefully, but none produced immediate results. Every passing hour reduced the chances of locating Amber alive. 4 days after the abduction, on the morning of January 17th, tragedy replaced uncertainty. A man walking his dog near a drainage creek behind an apartment complex in North Arlington discovered the body of a young girl partially submerged in the shallow water. The location was roughly 4 miles from the parking lot where Amber had last been seen. Investigators quickly confirmed the victim was Amber Hageman. The discovery transformed the investigation from an active kidnapping case into a homicide inquiry. The area surrounding the creek was immediately sealed off, while crime scene specialists documented every possible piece of evidence. Detectives searched for footprints, tire impressions, fibers, biological material, and anything that could identify the person responsible. Although forensic technicians recovered evidence from the scene, the passage of several days, changing weather conditions, and exposure to water complicated the examination. Even so, investigators believed the offender had likely chosen the isolated drainage area specifically because it reduced the risk of being seen, suggesting a level of planning rather than a random act of panic. As the autopsy began and detectives retraced Amber's final known movements minute by minute, one question overshadowed every aspect of the case. Who was the man driving the black pickup truck, and how had he disappeared so completely after committing a crime witnessed in broad daylight? The autopsy established that Amber had died only a short time after her abduction, confirming investigators had been working against an extremely narrow window from the very beginning. While authorities withheld several specific forensic findings to protect the integrity of the case, they publicly acknowledged that the available physical evidence was not sufficient to immediately identify the offender. Detectives believed the eyewitness account remained one of the strongest pieces of evidence, yet even that description could not distinguish one black pickup truck from thousands of similar vehicles operating across the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. As media coverage intensified, telephone lines at the Arlington Police Department were flooded with information. Hundreds of tips arrived during the first weeks, followed by thousands more over the years. Every credible lead demanded interviews, vehicle checks, background investigations, and comparisons against known offenders, but each promising direction eventually reached a dead end. As forensic science advanced through the following decades, the evidence collected in 1996 was repeatedly re-examined using newer laboratory techniques. Biological material was tested again. As DNA technology improved, fingerprints were reviewed, and investigators revisited witness statements with fresh eyes. The Federal Bureau of Investigation continued assisting local authorities, while detectives compared the circumstances of Amber's death with numerous violent offenders active in Texas during the same period. Several convicted serial criminals were examined, because aspects of their histories appeared to overlap with the crime, but no comparison produced evidence strong enough to support criminal charges. Investigators consistently emphasized that speculation could never replace proof, and despite persistent public theories, no suspect has ever been officially identified as Amber's killer. The absence of an arrest did not stop the investigation from evolving. Detectives reconstructed the timeline repeatedly, searching for overlooked details that might have seemed insignificant during the original inquiry. They tracked former owners of black pickup trucks matching the witness description, interviewed individuals who had lived near the abandoned grocery store, and appealed to anyone who might have traveled through the area that afternoon. Even decades later, authorities continued asking former residents to reconsider memories that might once have appeared unimportant. A single forgotten observation, investigators argued, could still provide the missing connection needed to solve the case. While the homicide remained unsolved, another story was beginning to unfold beyond the investigation itself. Only days after Amber's death, residents throughout North Texas questioned whether the public could have been warned sooner. Broadcasters discussing the tragedy received a suggestion from a local listener who wondered why police could not immediately interrupt radio programming whenever a child was abducted, allowing every driver and every family to begin watching for the suspect instead of learning about the crime hours later. The idea quickly attracted attention because Amber's kidnapping had occurred in broad daylight, in front of a witness, with a vehicle description available almost immediately. Many believed that if thousands of people had received that information within minutes, someone might have recognized the truck before it disappeared. Law enforcement agencies, broadcasters, and community leaders worked together to transform that simple proposal into an emergency notification program. The system became known as AMBER, officially standing for America's Missing Broadcast Emergency Response, while also preserving Amber Hageman's first name in her memory. What began as a regional partnership in Texas gradually expanded across the United States through cooperation between police agencies, television stations, radio networks, transportation departments, wireless providers, and later internet services. Emergency messages eventually reached electronic highway signs, mobile phones, navigation systems, and digital billboards, allowing information about an abducted child to spread across entire states within minutes rather than hours. According to the United States Department of Justice, the program has contributed to the safe recovery of hundreds of abducted children since its creation, demonstrating how one family's unimaginable loss reshaped emergency response procedures nationwide. Yet the success of the alert system has never erased the unanswered questions surrounding the original crime. Every notification carrying the word Amber serves as a reminder that the child whose name inspired the program never received the benefit of the system created because of her. December 12, 1981. What should have been a short trip home became the beginning of one of Canada's longest-running unsolved murder investigations. 14-year-old Dana Bradley had spent the afternoon with a friend in St. John's, Newfoundland. She planned to return home before the evening so she could celebrate her mother's birthday with the rest of her family. At that time, hitchhiking was still common across many parts of Newfoundland, especially among teenagers who often relied on passing motorists for transportation. Dana had used the practice before without incident, and nothing about that Saturday suggested it would end differently. She was last seen standing near the intersection of Duckworth Street and New Gower Street, waiting for a ride. Multiple witnesses later reported seeing her get into a light-colored sedan, driven by a lone man. It was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. When Dana failed to arrive home, her parents quickly realized something was wrong. This was not a teenager who regularly disappeared without telling anyone. As the evening turned into night, family members contacted friends, searched familiar places, and eventually notified police. Officers initially considered the possibility that she had accepted a ride and experienced a simple delay, but as the hours passed without a phone call or a single verified sighting, concern rapidly escalated. The Royal Newfoundland Constabulary launched a missing person investigation that soon expanded beyond the city. Volunteers joined officers in searching roadsides, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and isolated locations surrounding St. John's. Local radio stations broadcast descriptions of Dana and appealed for anyone who had seen her that afternoon to come forward. The investigation gained momentum after several independent witnesses described seeing Dana enter what appeared to be a full-sized, light-colored General Motors sedan, believed to have been manufactured during the early 1970s. Although descriptions varied slightly, investigators believed they were referring to the same vehicle. Witnesses also provided a general description of the driver. He was reported to be a white male, middle-aged, with dark hair and an average build. None of the descriptions were detailed enough to establish a positive identification, but together they offered detectives their first meaningful lead. Thousands of tips soon began arriving from across Newfoundland, forcing investigators to compare witness accounts, interview vehicle owners, and eliminate countless possibilities one by one. For nearly 4 days, the search continued without success. Search teams worked through freezing December conditions, hoping Dana had somehow survived and was waiting to be found. Instead, the investigation took a devastating turn. On the afternoon of December 16th, her body was discovered in a wooded area near Maddox Cove Road, several kilometers south of St. John's. The location was isolated enough that it was unlikely anyone would accidentally come across it, suggesting the offender had deliberately selected the site. Detectives immediately sealed the area, treating it as a homicide scene rather than simply the end of a missing person search. The crime scene presented investigators with details they would never forget. Dana's body had not been discarded carelessly. Instead, it appeared to have been placed in a strangely deliberate manner. One of the most discussed details was that her schoolbooks had been carefully positioned beneath one of her arms rather than scattered around the scene. To experienced investigators, that unusual placement suggested the offender had spent time at the location after the killing instead of fleeing immediately. Some detectives believed the arrangement reflected an attempt to restore a sense of dignity to the victim. Others argued it represented an effort to manipulate the crime scene or satisfy an unknown psychological need. Whatever the reason, it was highly unusual and became one of the defining features of the case. The medical examination confirmed that Dana had died only a short time after disappearing. Investigators were able to establish important forensic findings, but the available technology of the early 1980s placed clear limits on what could be recovered from physical evidence. DNA profiling had not yet become an investigative tool, meaning detectives were forced to rely heavily on witness statements, trace evidence, vehicle identification, and traditional police work. Every fiber, fingerprint, tire impression, and biological sample collected from the scene was carefully preserved in the hope that future scientific advances might reveal answers unavailable at the time. As news of the murder spread throughout Newfoundland, public fear intensified. Parents who had once considered hitchhiking an ordinary part of growing up suddenly warned their children never to accept rides from strangers. Hundreds of motorists voluntarily contacted police after realizing they had driven through the area that afternoon. Mechanics, dealership employees, and vehicle owners were interviewed as investigators attempted to identify every light-colored sedan matching witness descriptions. Detectives reconstructed Dana's final known movements minute by minute, hoping a forgotten observation or overlooked detail would expose the driver who had picked her up. Despite the enormous volume of information collected during those first weeks, every promising lead eventually reached the same frustrating conclusion. Someone had taken a 14-year-old girl from one of the busiest streets in St. John's in broad daylight, transported her to a remote location only a short drive away, and disappeared without leaving investigators enough evidence to identify him. The search for that unknown driver had only just begun. As investigators moved into the following months, the scale of the inquiry became almost unprecedented for Newfoundland. Detectives followed thousands of leads, interviewed an enormous number of witnesses, and examined countless vehicles matching the descriptions collected during the first days of the investigation. Every reported sighting of a light-colored General Motors sedan was traced as far as available evidence allowed. Owners were questioned, maintenance records were reviewed where possible, and potential routes between downtown St. John's and Maddox Cove Road were reconstructed repeatedly. Despite the extraordinary effort, every promising lead eventually dissolved under closer examination. The driver seen with Dana remained unidentified, and the investigation slowly transformed from an urgent homicide into one of Canada's most frustrating cold cases. The unusual condition of the crime scene continued to shape investigators' thinking. Detectives believed the offender was likely familiar with the isolated road where Dana's body had been left. The careful placement of her schoolbooks suggested actions that went beyond simple concealment. Criminal profilers who later reviewed the file proposed different interpretations. Some believed the offender experienced a brief sense of remorse after the killing, while others argued the arrangement reflected a need to control every aspect of the crime, including the final appearance of the victim. None of those theories could be proven, but they reinforced the belief that the offender had remained at the scene longer than necessary, increasing the possibility that unnoticed forensic evidence had been left behind. For several years, investigators continued receiving tips from members of the public. Names repeatedly surfaced only to be eliminated after interviews and evidence failed to support the allegations. Then, nearly 5 years after Dana's death, the investigation appeared to reach its most dramatic turning point. In the autumn of 1986, David Grant Somerton, unexpectedly confessed to killing Dana Bradley. His statement shocked both investigators and the public. After years without a suspect, authorities believed they might finally have the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Somerton was charged, and for a brief period, it seemed the case that had haunted Newfoundland since 1981 might finally be resolved. That hope quickly collapsed. As investigators attempted to verify Somerton's confession, significant problems emerged. Details within his account failed to consistently match the physical evidence gathered from the crime scene. He later withdrew the confession, claiming it had been false and that he had been pressured during questioning. Without reliable corroborating evidence linking him directly to the murder, prosecutors were left with a confession that could not withstand legal scrutiny. The homicide charge was ultimately abandoned. Instead, Somerton was convicted of public mischief for misleading investigators. His confession, once viewed as the solution to the case, became another obstacle that consumed valuable investigative time while leaving the identity of the true killer unanswered. Advances in forensic science offered investigators renewed hope decades later. Biological evidence preserved from the original investigation was re-examined using modern DNA technology, unavailable during the early 1980s. Analysts successfully developed a male DNA profile from evidence connected to the case. The discovery represented one of the most significant developments since Dana's murder, because it provided investigators with a scientific benchmark capable of excluding suspects with certainty. Several individuals who had attracted suspicion over the years were compared against the profile and eliminated. While the DNA did not immediately identify the offender, it confirmed that critical forensic evidence had survived for decades and could still play a decisive role if matched through future advances in genetic analysis. Investigators refused to allow the case to fade into history. New witness interviews were conducted as memories were revisited, and previously overlooked information was reevaluated. Specialized investigative teams reviewed thousands of pages of reports compiled over more than 4 decades, searching for inconsistencies or forgotten connections that earlier detectives may have missed. At one stage, renewed searches and excavations were carried out after information suggested physical evidence connected to the investigation might still exist. Although those efforts generated public attention, they failed to produce the decisive breakthrough investigators had hoped for. The murder of Dana Bradley also left a lasting impact beyond the investigation itself. Her death fundamentally changed public attitudes toward hitchhiking throughout Newfoundland. A practice once viewed by many families as ordinary quickly became associated with irreversible risk. Parents who had grown up accepting rides from strangers now warned their children never to do the same. The case became part of the province's collective memory, not only because it remained unsolved, but because it marked the end of an era when communities believed dangerous crimes happened somewhere else. More than 4 decades have now passed since that cold December afternoon. Yet investigators continue to emphasize that the case remains active rather than forgotten. Modern forensic techniques continue to evolve, particularly in the field of investigative genetic genealogy, a method that has solved numerous historic cold cases across North America. Detectives have publicly acknowledged that even the smallest overlooked detail, a forgotten conversation, or a future DNA comparison could finally identify the man who picked up Dana on what should have been an ordinary ride home. Until that day arrives, the most important question remains exactly as it was in 1981. A 14-year-old girl climbed into a stranger's car in broad daylight on one of the busiest streets in St. John's. Multiple people saw it happen. Investigators preserved evidence for future science. An apparent confession collapsed under scrutiny, and decades of relentless investigation still failed to reveal the identity of the person responsible. Few cold cases demonstrate more clearly that even an investigation built upon witnesses, physical evidence, and years of determined police work can remain unsolved when the one missing piece is the name of the killer. July 12, 1924. On a quiet summer morning in Vancouver, British Columbia, the death of a young Scottish immigrant appeared, at first glance, to be little more than another private family tragedy. By the time the day was over, police were already leaning toward a simple explanation. Within weeks, however, newspapers, politicians, lawyers, and ordinary citizens were asking a far different question. They were no longer debating how Janet Smith had died. They were asking whether the truth had been buried before the investigation had even begun. Janet Smith was only in her early 20s when she left Scotland in search of a better future in Canada. Like thousands of young women arriving from Britain during the early 20th century, she found employment as a domestic servant, a profession that promised stable wages but often placed workers behind the closed doors of wealthy households. She eventually became a housemaid for the family of Frederick Victor Taylor, a prominent Vancouver businessman whose social standing and financial influence made his residence one of the city's most respected homes. To the public, it appeared to be an ideal position. Few could have imagined that the house would soon become the center of one of Vancouver's most enduring criminal mysteries. The morning unfolded as any other. Members of the household went about their routines while Janet carried out her daily duties inside the large residence. Then everything changed. She was discovered in the basement with a fatal gunshot wound to her head. Nearby lay a revolver. Before investigators had fully documented the scene, speculation began spreading through the house. Some believed the shooting had been accidental. Others suggested suicide. Yet neither explanation seemed to satisfy everyone present. The revolver itself immediately became one of the most troubling pieces of evidence. Janet was not known to carry firearms, nor had friends or acquaintances described her as someone familiar with handling weapons. Those who knew her painted a picture of a hard-working young woman with plans for the future, rather than someone preparing to end her own life. No clear suicide note was found, and no convincing motive emerged during the earliest stages of the inquiry. Even before the newspapers became involved, whispers of doubt were already circulating throughout Vancouver. Despite those unanswered questions, investigators initially appeared willing to accept that there was little evidence pointing toward homicide. Critics would later argue that the investigation moved unusually quickly toward conclusions that required the fewest difficult questions. Instead of treating every possibility with equal caution, attention shifted almost immediately toward finding an explanation that could close the case without creating a public scandal for one of the city's most influential families. Whether that criticism was justified remains a matter of historical debate, but it became one of the defining themes of the entire case. As reporters descended on the Taylor residence, another name unexpectedly entered the story. Wong Foon Sing, a Chinese man employed by the family as a chauffeur, suddenly found himself under intense public scrutiny. Rumors spread that he and Janet may have known each other beyond their work at the house. Little reliable evidence supported the growing speculation, yet newspapers eagerly reported every new allegation. Vancouver in the 1920s was a city where prejudice against Chinese immigrants remained deeply rooted. Laws limiting immigration, widespread discrimination, and public suspicion meant that accusations against a Chinese worker could quickly gain traction, regardless of how much evidence actually existed. Police questioned Wong Foon Sing repeatedly as journalists searched for details that could transform a confusing death into a sensational headline. His statements attracted enormous attention, but accounts of exactly what he said varied between witnesses and newspaper reports. Some articles portrayed him as the obvious suspect, while others acknowledged that investigators possessed remarkably little physical evidence linking him directly to Janet's death. Even at this early stage, the investigation seemed increasingly influenced by rumor, public pressure, and competing narratives, rather than by clear forensic findings. Meanwhile, the physical evidence remained frustratingly limited. Crime scene preservation in the early 1920s bore little resemblance to modern forensic practice. Fingerprint examination was still developing, ballistic analysis lacked many of the techniques available today, and DNA testing was decades away from existence. Every mistake made during the first hours of the investigation carried lasting consequences. If evidence had been overlooked, contaminated, or misunderstood, there would be no second opportunity to recover it. Historians examining the case decades later would repeatedly return to those first critical decisions, arguing that the investigation may have lost its best chance of uncovering the truth almost immediately. Public confidence began to weaken as conflicting stories continued appearing in newspapers across British Columbia. Instead of resolving doubts, each new report seemed to introduce another contradiction. Why had investigators appeared so certain before all witnesses had been thoroughly examined? Why were so many assumptions being made despite the lack of definitive evidence? And perhaps most importantly, had the social status of those connected to the house influenced the direction of the investigation from the very beginning? Before authorities could answer those questions, the case entered an entirely new phase. What had started as a suspicious death inside a wealthy family's basement was about to become a public inquiry that exposed conflicting testimony, challenged police decisions, and forced Vancouver to confront uncomfortable questions about power, race, and whether justice could remain impartial when influential people stood at the center of a murder investigation. The public inquiry that followed quickly became unlike anything Vancouver had witnessed in years. Instead of restoring confidence, every hearing seemed to deepen the uncertainty surrounding Janet Smith's death. Witnesses offered statements that conflicted with earlier accounts, recollections shifted under questioning, and details that should have clarified the final hours of Janet's life instead created new doubts. Newspapers covered the proceedings almost daily, transforming what had begun as a private tragedy into one of the most closely watched legal controversies in British Columbia. The focus gradually shifted away from the gunshot itself and toward the conduct of the investigation, with many observers questioning whether crucial decisions had been influenced by social standing rather than objective evidence. At the center of the inquiry remained Wong Foon Sing. Prosecutors attempted to build a narrative suggesting that he had been responsible for Janet's death, yet the evidence presented never formed a complete or convincing chain. Much of the case relied on assumptions, disputed testimony, and interpretations rather than verifiable physical proof. Under careful examination, witnesses frequently disagreed over important details, while several claims reported in the press could not be firmly established during the hearings. As the proceedings continued, it became increasingly apparent that suspicion alone could not replace evidence. Although Wong Foon Sing remained under intense public scrutiny, no court ultimately convicted him of Janet's murder, and the accusations against him gradually weakened as the inquiry exposed the limitations of the investigation. At the same time, criticism of the authorities continued to grow. Legal officials openly challenged aspects of the police investigation, raising concerns about whether every lead had been pursued with equal determination. Questions were asked about how the crime scene had been examined, how quickly early conclusions had been reached, and whether investigators had overlooked possibilities that did not fit their initial assumptions. Those concerns proved especially damaging because they emerged not from rumor alone, but from formal legal proceedings. Instead of producing certainty, the inquiry revealed how many critical questions had never received definitive answers. The broader social climate of the period added another layer to the mystery. Vancouver, during the early 20th century, remained deeply divided by race and class. Chinese Canadians faced systemic discrimination through restrictive laws, economic barriers, and widespread prejudice. Historians examining the Janet Smith case have often argued that these realities cannot be separated from the investigation itself. Some believe Wong Foon Sing became an easy target because public opinion had already been shaped by racial stereotypes long before the evidence had been fully examined. Others maintain that investigators simply pursued the individual they considered most likely to possess relevant information. Whatever the truth, the controversy surrounding his treatment has remained one of the defining features of the case for more than a century. January 6, 1995. It was an ordinary winter morning in Surrey, British Columbia, when 23-year-old Melanie Carpenter arrived for another shift at a neighborhood tanning salon. The business was small, the pace was usually quiet, and like many similar salons at the time, employees often worked alone for hours. Nothing about that Friday suggested it would become the beginning of one of British Columbia's most haunting, unresolved homicide investigations. By the end of the day, Melanie had disappeared without warning, leaving behind a workplace that looked almost untouched, yet every minute that followed pointed toward the conclusion that she had not left willingly. Customers had visited throughout the afternoon, and nothing appeared unusual until the salon should have been preparing to close. When Melanie failed to return phone calls and could not be located, concern quickly turned into alarm. Family members knew her disappearance made no sense. She was regarded as dependable, close to her relatives, and had made no indication that she intended to leave or suddenly disappear. Friends described her as someone with plans for the future, rather than someone looking for a way out of her life. The silence surrounding her was completely out of character. Police were notified, and investigators soon arrived at the tanning salon. What they found was unsettling, precisely because so little seemed disturbed. There were no obvious signs of a prolonged struggle, no extensive damage inside the business, and nothing to immediately explain how a healthy young woman could simply vanish in the middle of a workday. Yet experienced investigators understood that the absence of visible violence did not mean no crime had occurred. In many abductions, events unfold in seconds, leaving behind surprisingly little physical evidence. The investigation shifted almost immediately toward tracing Melanie's movements after she was last seen alive. Detectives interviewed customers, nearby business owners, and anyone who might have crossed paths with her that afternoon. They reconstructed the timeline as carefully as possible, narrowing the window during which she had disappeared. Every passing hour made the possibility of finding her alive increasingly uncertain. But another discovery soon changed the direction of the investigation. Not long after Melanie vanished, transactions were made using her bank card. Investigators learned that someone had withdrawn money from her account after she had already disappeared. During the mid-1990s, automated teller machine surveillance was becoming an increasingly valuable investigative tool, and detectives quickly obtained the available security footage. Instead of providing another frustrating dead end, the recordings captured something investigators rarely obtained so early in a major homicide investigation. The surveillance images showed a man using Melanie's bank card at an automated teller machine. He appeared calm, spending only moments at the machine before leaving. To detectives, this was no random financial crime. Whoever possessed Melanie's card shortly after her disappearance was almost certainly connected to whatever had happened inside the tanning salon. The footage immediately became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Police distributed still photographs, appealed to the public, and began comparing the man's appearance with existing criminal records. The response came faster than investigators expected. Officers identified the man as Fernand Auger, a convicted offender with a significant criminal history who was living in the community under statutory release. His background immediately elevated the urgency of the investigation. Detectives now had someone whose movements needed to be reconstructed hour by hour, whose associates had to be interviewed, and whose recent activities demanded intense scrutiny. Instead of searching blindly for an unknown suspect, police suddenly believed they were closing in on someone they could identify by name. As investigators dug deeper, more pieces of the timeline began fitting together. Evidence suggested that Auger had been in Surrey on the day Melanie disappeared. His possession of her financial card could not easily be explained away as coincidence, and detectives increasingly viewed him as the central figure in the investigation rather than merely a person of interest. Surveillance images, financial records, witness interviews, and his own known movements gradually formed a picture that pointed in one direction. Although many questions remained unanswered, police believed they were approaching the moment when they could finally confront the man seen withdrawing money that did not belong to him. While officers worked to locate Auger, another devastating discovery brought hope of finding Melanie alive to an end. Her body was eventually found in the rugged Fraser Canyon region, a remote area located far from the Surrey salon where she had last been seen. The distance alone suggested deliberate effort to move and conceal the victim, making the crime scene dramatically different from the place where the investigation had begun. Medical examination confirmed that this was no missing person case. It had become a homicide investigation, and every available resource was redirected toward building a case against the man investigators already believed was responsible. Detectives prepared to make their move, convinced they were only one step away from placing the prime suspect under arrest, unaware that the case was about to take a turn that would prevent anyone from ever hearing the full truth of what had happened to Melanie Carpenter. Investigators believed they were finally within reach of an arrest. Compared with countless homicide investigations that begin with no suspect, no witnesses, and no meaningful trail, the Melanie Carpenter case appeared to be moving unusually quickly. Detectives had identified the man seen using her bank card, established his criminal background, and were gathering enough evidence to question him in connection with her disappearance and death. Yet before that confrontation could ever happen, the investigation took a turn that no detective could control. Fernand Auger died by suicide, ending the possibility of an arrest, a trial, or a confession. In a matter of moments, the only person believed to know exactly what had happened inside the tanning salon, and during the hours that followed, was gone forever. His death did not end the investigation, but it permanently changed its direction. Instead of preparing evidence for a courtroom, investigators were forced to determine whether the physical evidence, financial records, witness statements, and forensic findings were sufficient to explain the crime without hearing a single word from the man they considered responsible. Every unanswered question became significantly harder to resolve. Why had Melanie been targeted? Had she been specifically chosen, or had the encounter been completely random? What happened between the moment she disappeared from the salon and the moment her body was left in the Fraser Canyon? Those answers almost certainly disappeared with Auger. Although investigators never had the opportunity to prosecute him, the available evidence consistently pointed toward the same conclusion. The surveillance footage showing him using Melanie's bank card shortly after her disappearance remained one of the strongest links in the case. Combined with the timeline established through the investigation and his known movements, detectives publicly identified him as the prime suspect. Even so, Canadian law requires criminal guilt to be established in court, and with the suspect dead, that process could never take place. The distinction mattered deeply to Melanie's family. Police may have believed they knew who was responsible, but belief alone could never replace a judicial verdict. As the investigation became public, another issue quickly emerged. Fernand Auger was not an unknown man quietly living outside the criminal justice system. He had previously been convicted of violent offenses and had been released under federal supervision before Melanie's death. That fact immediately raised difficult questions about the effectiveness of Canada's correctional and parole systems during the 1990s. Critics argued that individuals with serious criminal histories required closer monitoring, while others questioned whether warning signs had been overlooked before the crime occurred. The discussion extended far beyond a single investigation, evolving into a broader debate about public safety and the responsibility of correctional authorities when supervising high-risk offenders. For Melanie's family, however, those institutional questions could never replace personal answers. Every homicide investigation is ultimately about a victim whose future disappeared in a single day. Melanie was only 23 years old, working an ordinary shift that should have ended with her returning home. Instead, her family spent the following days searching for hope before learning the worst possible outcome. They would never have the opportunity to hear the person believed responsible explain his actions, express remorse, or answer the countless questions that naturally follow such a devastating crime. The legal process that often allows families to confront an accused killer never existed in this case. The investigation officially remained open despite Auger's death. Detectives preserved evidence, documented every finding, and maintained the case file because the absence of a criminal conviction meant the investigation itself was never formally concluded through the courts. Modern forensic science continues to advance in ways investigators could scarcely imagine during the mid-1990s. DNA analysis has become dramatically more sensitive, digital imaging has improved, and cold case units routinely re-examine evidence collected decades earlier. Although no new suspect has emerged, preserved evidence remains valuable because advances in forensic technology sometimes answer questions that earlier generations of investigators could not. The murder of Melanie Carpenter occupies a unique place among Canadian cold cases because it exists in an uncomfortable space between certainty and uncertainty. Most unsolved murders leave investigators searching for an unknown offender. This investigation followed a different path. Police believed they had identified the man responsible, yet the justice system never had the opportunity to examine that conclusion in court. As a result, the case is remembered not because investigators failed to develop a suspect, but because circumstances prevented the final stage of justice from ever taking place. That difference continues to fuel discussion among investigators, legal experts, and those who study unresolved crimes. More than 3 decades have now passed since Melanie walked into the tanning salon for what should have been another routine day at work. The business eventually disappeared, the community changed, and many of the people directly involved in the investigation retired. But the central tragedy has never changed. A young woman lost her life. Her family lost the future they expected to share with her. And the one man believed capable of explaining every missing hour died before facing a single question in court. There was no dramatic cross-examination, no verdict announced before a judge, and no final statement acknowledging responsibility. Instead, the case ended with silence. The Kelly Morrisseau case remains one of the longest-running unsolved investigations connected to Canada's National Capital Region. Nearly 2 decades after a young Ottawa mother lost her life during the early hours of a winter morning, investigators still have no confirmed suspect, despite years of forensic work, witness interviews, and repeated public appeals. The unanswered questions surrounding her final movements continue to make the case a focus of public interest, and an enduring reminder of how even a promising investigation can reach a standstill. During the early morning of December 10, 2006, Kelly Morrisseau, a 27-year-old Indigenous woman from Ottawa, was last seen in the city's Vanier neighborhood. She was expecting her 4th child and was already the mother of 3 young children. Family members and investigators later worked together to reconstruct her final known movements, hoping that every confirmed detail could help explain how an ordinary evening developed into one of the region's most difficult unsolved cases. According to the investigation, Kelly was last observed entering a light-colored vehicle with an unidentified man. Witness information established this as one of the most significant moments in the timeline, because it represented the last confirmed sighting before contact with her was lost. Detectives would later devote considerable effort to identifying both the vehicle and its driver, believing they could provide crucial information about everything that followed. Only a relatively short time later, emergency services responded to a parking area within Gatineau Park, across the provincial boundary in Quebec. Kelly was found there with severe injuries and was still alive when first responders arrived. She was transported to hospital, where medical teams attempted to save both her and her unborn child. Despite those efforts, she later died from her injuries. The discovery immediately expanded the scope of the investigation. Kelly's final confirmed movements had taken place in Ottawa, Ontario, while the location where she was found fell under the jurisdiction of Quebec authorities. As a result, investigators from multiple agencies worked together to establish an accurate timeline, compare witness statements, examine forensic evidence, and determine where the incident had actually begun. One of the earliest questions concerned the location itself. Gatineau Park is widely known for its forests, scenic roads, and recreational areas rather than heavy overnight activity, particularly during the winter season. Detectives examined whether the parking area had been selected deliberately, whether Kelly had traveled there voluntarily, or whether the events leading to her death had started somewhere else before reaching that location. Establishing the sequence of events became one of the investigation's highest priorities. Forensic specialists carefully examined the available evidence recovered during the investigation. Publicly released information indicated that Kelly had resisted during the encounter, leading investigators to consider the possibility that the unidentified individual may also have left behind physical evidence. Alongside laboratory analysis, detectives reviewed witness accounts, searched for surveillance opportunities available at the time, and compared every lead that could help identify the unknown driver. As the investigation progressed, police appealed repeatedly to the public for assistance. Witnesses described the unidentified man believed to have been with Kelly shortly before the incident, and investigators later released a composite sketch based on those descriptions. They also asked anyone who had seen a light-colored vehicle traveling between Ottawa and Gatineau during the relevant time period to come forward, even if the information appeared insignificant. Detectives believed that seemingly ordinary observations might eventually complete the missing section of the timeline. Despite extensive investigative work, the identity of the man Kelly was last seen with has never been publicly confirmed. Over the years, investigators continued to review evidence as forensic technology improved and encouraged anyone with new information to contact police. Family members also maintained public appeals, expressing hope that someone who had remained silent might eventually decide to share information capable of moving the investigation forward. Today, the Kelly Morrisseau case remains officially unsolved. The available evidence establishes many of the major events surrounding that winter morning, yet several critical questions remain unanswered. Exactly what happened after Kelly entered the unidentified vehicle, why the journey ended at Gatineau Park, and who was responsible, have never been conclusively established through the public investigation. Those unanswered questions continue to define the case and explain why it remains one of the most closely followed unsolved investigations connected to the Ottawa region.